Shalom Aleichem, Olyavo Shalom Aleichem, Olyavo Shalom Aleichem, Be'al Kulam. Olyavo Shalom Aleichem, Olyavo Shalom Aleichem, Olyavo Shalom Aleichem, Be'al Kulam. Salam, salam, Aleinu be'al kol ha'olam. Salam, 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 Aleinu be'al kol ha'olam. Salam.
Hi, and welcome to Skira. I'm Rabbi Andrew Ergis, the CEO of Hebrew at the Center, and I was excited to put on shorts and one of my camp shirts. It's been a while since any of us have been able to be at camp, or most of us have been able to be at camp, but I spent 22 wonderful summers at camp, and I know so many of you are great lovers of camp as well. Hebrew at the Center is dedicated to the revolutionizing and teaching of Hebrew, not only in North America, but worldwide. And we're excited to be partnering with CASJE on this wonderful Skira program on Hebrew Infusion. Our Skira program is a platform where we bring to a larger audience new research on Hebrew and Hebrew language, and where we create an opportunity for researchers to engage with other academics, with practitioners, with funders, with lay leaders, with students, to help us think about how we take these new ideas and bring them to our work, wherever our work takes us. I'd love to start by finding out who's joining us today here in our Zoom. And to do that, what I'd like to do is quickly put up a poll. If you could let us know who is here. We have some camp directors, some researchers, a number of educators, other camp professionals, lay leaders, a few students. Let's take another 5 or 10 seconds here to let everybody complete the poll. Wonderful. So that you can all get a sense of who's in the room. There is certainly a range of people from different frameworks, but we have a wonderful group of educators that are joining us, as well as a meaningful group of camp directors and other professionals. Unfortunately, we don't have any campers. As we move into this webinar, we do want to both provide an opportunity for the researchers to share their thinking, but also create an opportunity for those of you who are joining us to raise questions, concerns, reactions. What we'd like to invite you to do is to place all of those in the Q&A so that they can really focus on their presentation and on answering your questions rather than going back and forth between the Q&A and the chat. Obviously, if you have something that you'd like to say to everyone or all the panelists, you can use the chat for that. So with that, I want to thank you once again. I'm glad to have you here at Skira, our exploration or inquiry around new Hebrew research. And with that, I'd love to introduce you to Sarah, to Jonathan, and to Sharon.
Hi, welcome everybody. We're very glad that you've joined us. We're gonna do a PowerPoint presentation to share some images and videos with you. And we're gonna start with a video of a comedian named Benji Lovett talking about Hebrew at Jewish summer camp.
Well, my Jewish identity, I would say, I wasn't born a big Zionist. I grew up going to Jewish summer camp. Graduates of Jewish summer camp, clap your hands. Ah. We love Jewish summer camp, don't we? We learn so much. We learn about Jewish culture, Jewish community, Jewish peoplehood. You know what we didn't learn? The Jewish language of Hebrew. We thought we learned Hebrew. We learned nouns. You see, nobody ever left camp actually able to construct a sentence. I mean, I guess if you ever find yourself in the situation where you have to say, singing, dancing, camper counselor, dining room. You might be okay. If you think you learned Hebrew at Jewish summer camp, try telling them that at LL Security. So, do you know Hebrew? Why, sure, I went to Jewish summer camp. זה מה אתה עושה פה? שקט בבקשה? Shabbat shalom. Charochel, mofo.
Okay, well, that is Benji Lovett, and it is an example of how Hebrew at Jewish summer camps is a topic of conversation among American Jews, and debate and humor. And this is something that we looked at in our study. We're going to talk about this today. Our main points are that most camps use Hebrew as a way of fostering connections, not proficiency, and that Hebrew use at camp has been a locus for diverse opinions about what it means to be an American Jew. This is a study that Sharon and Jonathan and I conducted from 2012 to 2018 and was just published as a book, Hebrew Infusion. It is a project of the Mandel Center at Brandeis University and with funding from the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education, Wexner Foundation, HUC, and CUNY. We did our research at camps, at archives. We did a survey, we did interviews, and here are the camps that we visited. We visited 36 camps around the US and one in Canada. And we visited camps of all different types, trying to represent the spectrum of American Jewish overnight camps. Just some definitions of terms that we use. One is a continuum of Hebrew richness. That is that Hebrew is used in different ways at different camps, but we can kind of put the camps along a continuum where some camps have a lot of Hebrew and some camps have hardly any. But all of the camps that we studied have at least a little bit of Hebrew, even if it's just some prayers or a few words to discuss things in Jewish life. Another concept that we introduce in the book is Hebrew as a flexible signifier. That is that Hebrew can mean different things, can have different social meanings in different contexts. In some cases, it might signify Israel. In some cases, it might signify Jewish religion. In some cases, it might signify camp. And in all of these cases, it signifies Jewishness to varying extents and in varying ways. Another term is Camp Hebraized English, which we also call CHE, which is a register of Jewish American English that includes Hebrew words. And this can include both Jewish life words and camp words. Jewish life words are words used in other Jewish communal settings like Shabbat Shalom, Ruach, Birkat Hamazon, and B'tei Avon. And camp words are words used primarily at camp, especially for things that happen at camp like tzrif, chadar ochel, madrich, and pe'ula. Here's an example of a sentence that uses both camp words and one Jewish life word. Madrichim, madrichot, you know which chanichim from your tzrifim need to take meds. After the birkat, please go directly to the teatron for peulat erev. That is a Camp Hebraized English sentence. Now, Camp Hebraized English is one aspect of Hebrew infusion, another term we introduce in the book. Hebrew infusion is when camp staff members incorporate elements of Hebrew into the primarily English-speaking environment through songs, signs, games, and words. And the primary goal of infusion is identity formation and connection rather than Hebrew proficiency. The connection that we're talking about is between the Jewish camper and the Hebrew language and that camp or American Jews or the Jewish people or Israel, various Jewish collectivities. So it's this three-way ideological connection. And this is not just a Jewish camp thing. It is a broader phenomenon that we call ethno-linguistic infusion, when community leaders incorporate fragments of the group language to foster ideological connections between the individual, the language, and the group. And this happens in an environment in another language. For example, LM Pomo Indians in California don't have proficiency in their language for the most part. So community leaders use elements of this language like greetings, blessings, and songs in a primarily English environment. And in Cornwall, England, the Cernewic language hasn't been spoken by children since the 19th century, and it is still used in many signs because it is seen as an important part of the Cornwall identity. So what does Hebrew infusion look like at camp? Well, I'm going to give you some examples of practices that we found at camp. And in the top right corner, you'll see the percentage of camps that report doing this particular practice. And it looks so weird to see people touching each other and not having masks, right? But anyway, here we go. So blessings, songs, and prayers, all camps have that to some extent. Group names, having Hebrew group names for the different age groups or the bunks at camp is also quite common. Names for activities, like this schedule where almost all of the words on the schedule are in English, but note they're in Hebrew, but note they're in English letters and they are said within English sentences. Same with locations at camp. Many of the locations at camp have Hebrew names like Chadar Ochel, Mirpa'ah, Beit Am, Beit Kehillah. Now, when we look at the Hebrew words used at camp, we find that camps of all different networks use Jewish life words. And then when we look at camp words, we see that there is a much bigger discrepancy, that some camps use a lot of these and some use very few. The camps that use a lot are in Zionist networks like Ramah, B'nai Akiva, Young Judea, and Habonim Dror. URJ and Hashomer HaTzair and other non-Orthodox camps are somewhere in the middle. And then at the lower end of the use of camp words, we see Canadian Young Judea, JCC Association, camps with no network, other Orthodox camps besides B'nai Akiva camps, and independent Jewish camps. Another common usage of Hebrew at camps is in signs. We see liturgical and biblical quotes presented in artistic placards and murals. We see camp signs that are representing locations that are sometimes in Hebrew, sometimes also in transliteration. And we also see pedagogical signs. People do not need this sign to know that that is a chair. It is labeled in Hebrew for both pedagogical reasons, to teach the word for chair in Hebrew, but also for symbolic reasons to highlight the importance of Hebrew in this camp setting. And sometimes you'll see lists of words like this list of kitchen words, for example. Another common use of Hebrew is in teaching activities. These are often ritualized as games, skits, and songs intended to teach some Hebrew words and to really make Hebrew fun. And these are often led by visiting Israeli staff members. And sometimes these skits involve homophony, like I have a Hershey kiss in my pocket, pocket. And it works much better with an Israeli accent. And for example, some of the most common ones of these skits are mazleg and tik. There's a fork in Ma's leg, and a skit where someone says, "Oh, I like your tik," and so the other person says, "Oh, there's a tick. Oh no, where's the tick?" Like a bug. So then a Hebrew superhero comes in and saves the day by explaining the confusion. And these kinds of skits may not really teach a lot of Hebrew words, and if they do, they might teach words that are not that useful. The point of these skits is mostly to make Hebrew fun, to emphasize Hebrew as a fun part of American Jewish life, and also to emphasize the connections between English and Hebrew. There are also other methods for teaching words, like the sandwich method. We're going to the Agam, lake, Agam. That clap is a Hebrew sandwich. Or informal teaching, like a big ma'agal with everybody in it. That's a phrase that they might use, and then a counselor might say to a new camper, let's make a big circle. Ma'agal means circle. And sometimes you'll have an Israeli who just teaches random words to campers, such as the counselor from Israel who stands at the top of the water slide and won't let the kids slide down until they learn a Hebrew word or say a Hebrew word. And the kids might not remember these words, but it really emphasizes the fun nature of Hebrew at camp. Israeli shlichim at camp also use Hebrew informally with campers. And Hebrew is also used in call and response sequences. For example, at Camp Bechol Lashon, they visit a new Jewish community around the world each day. And when they're getting clues as to which community they're going to visit, they say this phrase in a ritualized way, Eifo Eliyahu Ba'olam. Or at Camp Gilboa, where the leaders might say, Shabbat Shalom, Machaneh Gilboa, and the camp will respond, Shabbat Shalom, Michael, Jessica, Sarah. And then they'll ask about each group, whether they're there. Nitzanim, Kulam Po, Kulanu Po, Sayalim, Kulam Po, Kulanu Po. And this kind of ritualized use of Hebrew might seem like an immersive Hebrew environment, but really to participate, you only need to know the set phrases that are said. And we see this with announcements as well. For example, saying Safsalim ala shulchanot, or Gesher lemigrash kadursal, Nitzanim legazebo banim. These kinds of announcements, all you need to do is listen for your group name and the place that you're supposed to go, and you don't really need to be able to form or understand full Hebrew sentences. Less common at camp, but still found at some camps, especially Ramah camps, is novel sentences in Hebrew, which requires more proficiency, not just understanding the set phrases. Even less common at camp is Hebrew classes. And we see that even the Hebrew classes that we have at camp are intended primarily to make Hebrew seem fun. Few camps do theatrical productions, and even fewer have immersion programs or even full immersion camps. So what we see here is that the practices that are much more common at camps are the infusion practices. And the classes and the immersive practices are much less common at camps. And this relates to their goals. Most camps are interested in connection, not proficiency. When we asked about various goals of camp directors, the proficiency goals were quite low, and the infusion goals were important to about half or a little more of camps, and the Jewish connection goals were primary. So the use of Hebrew at camp is really about Jewish connection much more than teaching Hebrew. And now Jonathan will take over.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And thank you for really setting the table for us. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideologies of these camps. And in order to do that, I want to first tell a little story and get a sense a little bit about how the story sort of relates to a couple of the differences between a few camps. And then I'll tell a third story as well, or a second story as well. So the first story I want to tell you takes place in 1950. And it takes place in the Poconos. There were 2 Hebrew-rich camps in the Poconos. There were actually more than 2. There were 3 Hebrew-rich camps in the Poconos. There were 2 Masad camps in the Poconos. Masad was a Hebrew-speaking camp. And there was Camp Ramah in the Poconos, also a very Hebrew-rich camp. Some would say a Hebrew-speaking camp as well. There was a guy by the name of, it's funny, his name was Moshe Feinstein, but he's not the Moshe Feinstein that was the rabbinical leader. He was Moshe Feinstein, who was the head of a Hebrew teachers college by the name of Herzliya. He had visited Poconos, and then he came to Masad, and he was all up in arms because what he saw at Ramah Poconos was, rather than seeing the camp of, the flag of the state of Israel, he saw a flag with the 10 Commandments. Apparently, the administration at Camp Ramah was trying to figure out how to sort of, I guess, gesture to their Jewish identity, but at the same time, they were worried about being accused of dual loyalties to two countries, and therefore, rather than put the flag of the State of Israel up, Poconos decided to put the flag of the Ten Commandments up. And this guy was very, very Zionistic, and Moshe Feinstein goes to Mossad and he's railing about this, getting everybody at Mossad really upset about it. And a kind of informal group of people at Mossad decide that they are going to take action against this terrible affront to Israel and to Hebrew, and they decide to rent a Piper Cub, a small aircraft, and they print up a bunch of leaflets, and on the leaflets, are statements about how the importance of Israel and the like, and they fly the Piper Cub to Camp Ramah, and they release the leaflets on the camp. Unfortunately, when they flew the Piper Cub over to the camp, it turned out that they came during lunch. Everybody was in the dining room. Nobody saw the airplane. To make matters a little bit worse even than that, there was a strong wind that day, and all of the leaflets ended up flying into the woods rather than landing on the ground of the camp. It was only a few days later when a counselor with his campers was hiking in the woods that they actually found some of these leaflets and brought them back, and they were able to make the connection between Mossad and Ramah. Now, this was a big deal, and Larry Coburn, who may be on this call, I saw him on the list of people who might be on this call. He actually wrote a letter to his parents. He was at Camp Mossad that summer, and he wrote a letter to his parents about this. So this was clearly not a secret cabal that organized this, but rather it was the Mossadniks as a whole were really upset about the Ten Commandments and what it meant. And the reason why I tell this story is because it really gives us a sense of the difference between two Hebrew-rich camps here. On the one hand, we have Mossad, and on the other hand, we have Ramah. And Sarah, I'm having trouble advancing this, so maybe you can advance it? Okay, great. So both of them ostensibly Hebrew-speaking camps, and yet they each had their own ideology about Hebrew and their own ideology about Israel. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start with Mossad. For Mossad, the emphasis was really on Hebrew Renaissance as a way of making sure that Judaism and Jewish life would continue not only in Israel, but also in the diaspora. The people who started Camp Mossad were part of a group of young people from an organization called the Histadrut HaNoar HaIvri, which is basically a Hebrew cultural society. And they were very, very keen on this idea that Hebrew was the key, as this quote from Shlomo Schultzinger, the head of Camp Ramah, Camp Mossad, indicates, that Hebrew was the key to the Jewish treasure house, and that it was very, very important to transmit Hebrew to the younger generation. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that two artifacts from Mossad really tell the story of how Hebrew was incorporated into Mossad. On the one hand, if you look on the left hand of your screen, you see the Mossad English Hebrew Dictionary, the Milon Shimushi Angli Ivri Shal Mossad. This was an English Hebrew dictionary that was actually created by Schultzinger and others at the camp so that people would be able to speak Hebrew in daily conversation at the camp. And as you see from the photo on the right, there were shlatim, there were posters, there were plaques all over the camp with Hebrew words so that people would remember the Hebrew, and even something as sort of quotidian as baseball was done in Hebrew. Everything was supposed to be done in Hebrew. Now, whether or not Hebrew is actually spoken in the bunks with lights out or whenever, I've spoken to different people and I've gotten different stories about that. But certainly the goal here was Hebrew. The emphasis of the camp was on Hebrew speaking. Now, if we go to the next slide, if we look at Ramah, on the face of it, it seems very similar. You look at this picture of the canteen at Ramah, you see that are the Hebrew names of the items that you can get at the canteen. I know it's a little hard to look at, but then you have the pictures. So they're even doing one better than Mossad in this picture. They're not even using the English. They're just using pictures of things, using pictographs as a way of encouraging Hebrew. And yet what we do find out over time, however, is that as devoted to Hebrew as Ramah was, in actuality, by even as early as the mid-1950s, there was a mixture of Hebrew and English that was being utilized at Camp Ramah, what Sarah before called Camp Hebraized English, breaking down the barriers between English and Hebrew, going back and forth between English and Hebrew. If we go to the next slide, we can see that the reason why is because whereas Mossad really emphasized Hebrew as a value in and of itself, for Ramah, Hebrew was a means to an end. Hebrew was a means to an end. They were trying to create a leadership for the conservative movement. They wanted to instill young people with the skills and the knowledge that they would need in order to be committed Jewish leaders. Knowing Hebrew is part of that, but it is instrumental rather than intrinsic to the value. And over time, because of various reasons that we can get into maybe during the question and answer period, having to do with counselor training, having to do with the fact that most of the kids were coming from supplementary schools or religious schools rather than from day schools, the level of Hebrew ended up dropping off over time. If we go to the next slide, we see here some quotes from some people who are prominently involved in the camp, which really reflects what I've been talking about. Of course, just looking at the second quote, I should point out that by the 1960s, Ramah was a more forthrightly Zionist camp, but in the 50s, they were very conflicted about the Zionism, just as JTS, their sponsoring organization, was conflicted about Zionism. People who know a lot about the Jewish Theological Seminary probably know that Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the seminary, wouldn't even let Hatikvah be played at the graduation ceremonies in 1948, shortly after Israel was created, for the same reasons that we talked about before with the Ten Commandments. So if we move on to the next slide, we see here a quote from Bill Novak talking about exactly what we were mentioning before, this Camp Hebraized English. And Novak is complaining here about basically the same thing that we saw Benji Lovett complaining about, that it was all about nouns, that people actually weren't being taught Hebrew. And yet, if you go a little bit beneath the surface, you'll see that a Hebrew language was being, not a Hebrew language, but a language of camp was being created that was Hebrew rich, even if it wasn't exactly Hebrew. It was a camp Hebraized English, as we talked about before. So if we move on to the next slide, I just want to take 2 more minutes to talk about camps on the opposite end of the spectrum, the JCC camps. If you want to understand why it is that there is Camp Hebraized English in the JCC camps, I think you need to go back to the 1960s and a report that was written in the 60s for the American Association of Jewish Education, which was the forerunner of JESNA, where there was an argument that these camps were Jewish-sponsored camps, but there was very little Jewish programming at these camps. How do we increase Jewish programming? If we go to the next slide, they struggled with this, but an answer came from a man by the name of Asher Meltzer, who at the time was the head of Surprise Lake Camp, which is the oldest JCC camp, and later he becomes sort of more a head of the whole kind of segment of the camping movement that was what today is the JCCA. And his idea is, let's focus on Israel and Israel identity. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use Israelis, we're going to use shlichim, we're going to use Israeli culture. And part of that Israeli culture, of course, is Hebrew. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that even though the shlichim program itself actually begins at Camp Ramah, because they want to bring Hebrew-speaking counselors and specialists to the camp to maintain a Hebrew-rich environment. Very, very early on, by 66, Surprise Lake Camp joins, and then the URJ camps join, and then Mossad joins. And then if we go on to the next slide, we see that these ideas of how to use the shlichim are going to vary from camp to camp. For some camps, it's about creating an Israeli atmosphere, which includes some Hebrew. For other camps, it is mostly about compensating for the shortage of counselors who know how to speak Hebrew. And generally, for all of these camps, it's about creating more connections between Israel and America, which becomes more important after the Six-Day War. And then my final slide, which I think really sort of connects to Sharon's presentation, is just how quickly the shlichim program develops. Sharon will talk more about that. But what I want to point out here is if you look at 1978 as just a kind of a snapshot, you'll see that there were 283 shlichim that were sent to camps that year. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see 96 of those went to Jewish Welfare Board camps, what today we would call JCCA camps. And then you see the rest were spread out between Mossad, Ramah, the Reform Movement, the Zionist camps, etc. Now, 96 sounds like a lot, but of course there were a lot more JCCA camps. So there were fewer shlichim at each of these camps, whereas at Mossad and Ramah, and to some extent the Reform Movement camps, you would have more shlichim per camp. But you get a sense of how Israel and Hebrew were brought in to these JCCA camps, in part as a result of the shlichim program. Okay, let's on to Sharon.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks, Sarah and Jonathan, and thanks, Andrew, for putting this together. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Israelis at camps in a more contemporary way. And I hope at the end that we'll have some time to go back to the things that Sarah laid out and why Camp Hebraized English serves the type of role that it serves at camp, and thinking a little more about that. But for now, I want to focus on the shlichim, and we can see in this picture that the growth is pretty exponential, and continuing to grow. Sarah, can you go to the next slide? So what I want to just briefly touch on is, what role do shlichim play in bringing Hebrew to camp, and Hebrew at camp, and how can we think about this resource in new ways? And by resource, I mean the shlichim. So in 2018 on the Sochnut site, it said, as you can see, we match shlichim based on their skills. We have shlichim that, are experienced in all specialty areas. And you can see that Hebrew is one of the things here that is highlighted. And so it's important to remember that shlichim are coming to camp, Israelis are working at camp and doing lots of different things. They're not necessarily just brought as Hebrew representatives, or even necessarily just as representatives of Israel, but they're also filling important roles at camp. And more, it's important for the shlichim to feel a connection, to talk about their own Jewish journey with those of the campers and staffs. And so a lot of the literature and the way that the Sochnut talks about, the Shlichim, is about making these meaningful personal connections, which I do think, I will just say that I think Shlichim, by and large, are successful at doing. So in our research, we were able to go to the orientations that they do with the Shlichim, both in Israel, and we took part, we were able to observe at an initiative that involved Shlichim here in the United States. And these are some of the comments that came out, that, you know, Shlichim are meeting a different kind of Judaism when they come to the United States. They're landing on a different plane, a world away where the Jewish thing is very different. And one Sochnut leader said, you know, if you don't know Judaism, that's okay. So I think these quotes encapsulate a recognition that that being Jewish in Israel is different in some ways than being Jewish in the United States. By and large, the Israelis that come over are really the elite of Israeli society, but they also tend to skew more secular. And so they don't know about many of the ways in which American Jews typically express their Jewishness, things like synagogue and other kinds of practices. So what we saw is that when Shlichim arrive at camp, after they go through their own adjustment, which takes some time, and they understand that they're in a different space, what we saw, interestingly enough, is that they quickly come to understand that there is this thing called Camp Hebraized English, and that the kinds of Hebrew that are being used at camp are really quite different from the ways that they know how to use Hebrew in Israel. And so you see, even they become aware of phonological differences, like instead of saying mazal tov, mazel tov. And often we heard Israelis take on these forms of Camp Hebraized English, because again, what's important to them is making a connection with campers, making a connection with staff. And so if if that meant saying hadar or different ways, or not even with a chet, but a hadar, ochel, or something like that, then shlichim were going to, we heard them often using this language as well. In terms of the lexicon, they adapted words that don't exist in Israel, things like pinik, which is personal nikayon, and I think all of these lexical items, in my mind at least, they really speak to an incredible creativity that exists at camp, and I truly believe that the creativity that Sarah, Jonathan, and I saw with the way that Hebrew is integrated in English settings is really quite phenomenal and really unique. Sarah, can you go to the next slide? So also we saw things like semantic differences, like words like curfew, as you can imagine. Curfew, when used in Israel, has a much different meaning than it does at camp, which in terms of referring to kids, getting back to the bunk at a certain time at night. And it's not something about, how it's used in Israel. Words like shmirah also, and of course many of the Israelis that are coming are after the army, so particularly these words resonate in different ways, but they quickly grow to understand how these words are being used in the local context. The syntax that Sarah mentioned before, this sort of fluid sentences in which English and Hebrew coexist, becomes quite natural to them too. The pragmatics, and often that, the way in which Israel is represented at camp. So, they realize that they are fitting into a particular, they fit into the pragmatics of what it means to bring Israel to camp. So at some camps, not all, but there are some camps that are singing songs in Hebrew, which may not, be sung anymore in Israel, maybe just on what's it called on Saturdays, Shabbat Shkita or something like that on the Israeli radio. And then they also realize that in some ways that they have to do performances of Israel and their own Israeliness. So whether that is an Israeli day, which camps often will designate one day of the calendar, of the camp calendar, as Israel Day, or a morning or an afternoon, and they make falafel, the kinds of Israel materiality, and by that I mean it's like the stuff that they bring that represents Israel. So whether it's, bazooka gum, or posters, or things from their own backgrounds, things from their own experiences, bringing that stuff and talking about it with campers. This is, these are different types of performances of Israeliness. So what we see is that, is bringing Israel the same thing as using Hebrew at camp? And we have quotes that, like, through Hebrew language, we bring Israel into camp. So remember those words and use them in camp. Hebrew is the living language of the Jewish people. Now this was said to a bunch of camp staff, and one of the counselors said, is Hebrew education the same as Israel education? And in response they heard, why not? So often these two things are conflated. So if you're using Hebrew, you are in fact bringing Israel to camp. Next slide, Sarah. Thank you. So we have these questions, and we refer to them in the book as these ideologies, these beliefs that people have about language. And one of these things is about authenticity. What is the authentic Hebrew? And at Camp Mosheva, we had someone say, I tell kids and staff it couldn't be camp that talks about Hebrew and didn't have authentic Israelis who speak the authentic language. So again, this is sort of a judgment about the type of Hebrew that is being used at this is really a judgment about Camp Hebraized English, that it is not an authentic form of Hebrew language. And I think in our book, we take a slightly different position about that, but that is clearly what that director is pointing to. We also have, I won't read this whole quote, but the difference between whether the focus should be on verbs or nouns, as if in either verbs or nouns or adjectives or anything else for that matter, the real authentic aspect of a language lies. And that's probably linguistically a bit ambiguous. I don't think that linguists have a sense of where language resides, whether it's in the language, whether it's in the verbs or the nouns. But it's clear that people have ideologies about where the authentic Hebrew lies. We also have discourses or beliefs about expertise, about who is the expert Hebrew speaker. So one of the most entertaining aspects of being a camp is seeing all the secular Israelis having to sit through tefillah all the time, and they have no idea what anything means. They're not experts, in other words, in the kind of Hebrew that is being used at this particular camp. There's also discourses of coolness. Having Israeli staff members here is just so great, just so kids can be exposed to Israeli culture. The kids also think the Israelis are really cool because they've come from Israel. On Israel Day, Israelis sold absolute crap at the shuk. Kids went nuts for total crap. Kids thought it was really cool to get things with Hebrew written on that. And I think this is really maybe an extreme quote, but often we heard that Israelis were in charge of the ropes course or particular things because they were super cool and seen as super hip. And in some senses, American counselors didn't have that degree of hipness in certain ways. We also saw some fissures or some breakdowns, whereas the Shlichim Hebrew's expertise was not always seen or valued as Jewish knowledge. It was seen as something else. So the way we saw this in our study is that we often saw that the Jewish educational programming of the camp was actually separated from the Shlichim programming that they would do. Often Shlichim were not necessarily seen as educators, language educators or otherwise. And I think that partly it's because they're not educators. They're often right after the army, they haven't been trained as educators. And yet they're being put in a position to do to be educators. Now that doesn't mean they haven't had experience maybe in the Sofim or something else, but they don't necessarily know American camps and American Jewish education. We saw differences between American and Israeli Jews, and sometimes as much as they're able to make a personal connection with each other, they're sometimes a void about not really understanding each other's cultures. And so during the summer of 2015, when there was the Gaza invasion, this was a very, very difficult summer for Israelis. And they felt very, very isolated at camp because it was a real recognition that their experience as Israeli Jews was radically different from the American Jewish experience. Often in camps, it wasn't even spoken about, the Gaza situation. Israelis realize they can't speak too much Hebrew because they don't want to be, they don't want to alienate. Camps aren't necessarily interested in that much Hebrew. They want some Hebrew. They don't want it to be as if they're showing off. And also there is a thing that Israelis don't necessarily want to use Hebrew. Israelis are coming doing shlichut for lots of reasons. And not one of them is sometimes to improve their own English or to have it on their own resumes, because it's become a thing of some value actually for shlichim to have this on their own resumes for their own professional or other trajectories. So I'm just going to go quickly toward these because I'm already out of time, but we see that Israelis also had their own language ideologies, and they often question, well, what kind of Hebrew is it that actually American campers are using? They know so much, and yet they don't know certain things. As the second quote here says, it seems so strange to them that American Jews can sing all this stuff, and yet they can't say, I have to go to the bathroom. So again, they have their own sort of sense of what's important. And Sarah, you can maybe, big question. So the last thing I'll just have to say is one of the things, especially for any camp directors or camp people on this, that in the signage, it's really quite interesting because you see that as much as that there are Hebrew speakers at camp, the way that Hebrew gets rendered or represented in signage at camp is really toward different audiences. And you could just see that whether camps make a decision whether you use block or cursive script, whether to use vowels or not values, this is really decisions about what kind of campers they have. And I wish I could talk a little bit more about how this connects the shlichim, but I'm already over time. So I think we're going to open it up to questions at this point so that everyone who has some questions out there can speak to us. And we're interested to hear what you have to say. So thanks so much. Andrew? Or are we navigating the questions?
Yeah, I think so. So
okay.
Let's see. Someone asks, when you say connection, not proficiency, are you arguing that proficiency does not afford connection? No, absolutely not. In fact, the opposite. Of course, proficiency affords connection, but most of these camps aren't interested in proficiency. So camps that are interested in proficiency are absolutely also interested in connection, but the camps that are interested in connection are not necessarily interested in proficiency.
Yeah, proficiency is one way to foster connection. I think what we're finding at these camps is that there are multiple ways that Hebrew can be used to foster connection. Hebrew-rich camps will use Hebrew. Other camps may use just Hebrew, individual Hebrew words, or Camp Hebraized English as one means to foster connection.
So if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. Somebody asks, is there an indication that some camps or campers will become dissatisfied with Infusion and seek immersion programs?
So there is a program called twentieth, which was instituted a few years ago. by Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life and other partners. And it's been instituted in day camps thus far, but it really harkens back to an immersion model like Masad, like the Chalutzim program at Azrui, one of the reform camps. And it's, I think from everything I've heard, it has done a wonderful job. I just spoke with Amy Scott Cooper at Ramah a couple of days ago, and she told me that they've been very, very pleased with it, but they're a little bit worried about whether or not it would work in a overnight environment, because they're afraid that campers are not going to be able to express themselves to the counselors, and some of the parenting, sort of that goes on at camp would be difficult in Hebrew. And that was kind of interesting to me, because it's definitely true that at Masad, at least the Masad that I remember from when I was a kid, it wasn't a very touchy-feely camp between campers and counselors. And certainly one of the reasons why Ramah sort of veered away from that is because they instituted under Seymour Fox a much more sort of an approach to counseling that was much more of a, I don't know what the right word is, but like maybe Sarah or Sharon can help me here, kind of a more loving, a more, sort of creating a warm atmosphere. And Ramah found that it was very difficult to do that in Hebrew.
Yeah, I did encounter some campers at a Ramah camp who said they would be interested in an immersion program if it was made available. But I haven't heard of anyone who was in contemporary camps who said they are not interested, they're sick of this infusion and they want just immersion. But it is really great to see how immersion programs are becoming more common in day camps, and I hope to see them in overnight camps as well, because it seems like a great opportunity. You have the kids there for so many weeks, although unfortunately the weeks keep getting shorter. I mean, the time that kids spend at camps keeps getting shorter, but it is a good opportunity for immersion.
So Arnie has a couple of questions here. I don't know, Sharon, I don't want to put you on the spot, but since you haven't answered anything yet, do you want to take either of these questions?
Yeah, I don't see the questions just because I'm working.
It would be great to hear from you about what you think the opportunities are going forward. And then Arnie also asks, what have you learned about the strength of Hebrew as a connector that reinforces identity or connection to Jewish peoplehood?
Okay, so one of the things I think going forward is that I hope that our book has at least not only started this conversation, but has maybe caused people who work in camps and possibly other Jewish educational settings to at least pause and think about the type of Hebrew that they're using and why, and give it some what we call meta-linguistic, talking about language, talking about Hebrew, like what do we have at camp? What are our goals as an educational institution? How does Hebrew fit into these goals? How do we do Jewish? What kind of Jewish camper, staff member do we want to produce? What are our values? And I think that often, Hebrew is sort of it's literally, carved into buildings. It's sort of part of camp, but it becomes, because in some camps, even camps that you don't hear necessarily a lot of Hebrew, you see it in buildings, but sometimes in its ubiquity, it almost becomes invisible. And I think that you don't even realize, oh wait, we have this here. What is this? Why do we have these signs? How can we, utilize these sign or signage in general to connect with our mission, or whatever that mission is? And I think for every camp, obviously it's going to be different, because camps really have different missions, they have different values, and they have different campers, they have different audiences, right? Clientele, I guess you could say. But I think that, one of the things that I'm really hopeful about is that it seems that people, after reading the book or or talking to us have said that, wait, this has given them the opportunity to pause and think about why Hebrew, if at all, and then ways of doing it. So, like, why are we doing those skits? Like, is that really what we want? Is that really, the best way? And I think that another thing that I'm hopeful about is that this can also continue strong conversations about the role of shlichim at camp and Israelis in general. So not just those that come through the Sochnut, through the Jewish Agency, but others in general, because there are, Israeli staff members who maybe grow up in the United States or something like that. So I think that I'm very optimistic about that. And the second thing was a connection. What was that second part of the question, Jonathan? I'm sorry.
The question was about what have you learned about the strength of Hebrew as a connector that reinforces identity or connection to the Jewish people?
So I think one of the things, now, there's always going to be this tension about, is this an inferior form of Hebrew or inferior form of language that's being used at camp? These words, these nouns, no one can make a real sentence, all that kind of dialogue and discourse we hear. But I think that despite, let's put that aside. I think that whatever Camp Hebraized English is or is not, I think that it does incredible identity work for camps. And I think that it is part of camp rituals. It is part of their traditions. It is what makes someone a camp insider. It makes you feel a part of a particular camp. You're part of this camp, not that camp, because in one of those things is because of the ways that you use language. And I think that that's incredibly powerful. So I never dismiss it. Again, I think it's incredibly creative. That doesn't mean to say that it can't be done in more intentional and purposeful ways, again, that align with mission. But I see it as a deeply important thing, and it shouldn't just be dismissed. I don't think the point of our book is to say, wait, this is what you're doing, but it's not good, and you should be, focusing on something else. That's not what we're trying to say here. And I'll let Sarah and Jonathan comment also.
I would just very, very quickly.
No, I think we're out of time. We have to turn it over to Ariel. Yeah.
Hi there. I'm sorry to cut short such generative conversation. Knowing the panelists, I'm not too shy to volunteer them. Perhaps some of them would be willing to share their contact information if there are any further questions. I'll leave that to them, maybe to put that in the chat. I'm Ariel Levitas. I'm the managing director of CASJE, the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education. And we had the good fortune to help seed this project, and it's been fantastic to see it grow and bloom into the fantastic book that it is. I'm just gonna, if you'll permit me to tell a short family anecdote. And my family summer, perhaps like your family summer, did not turn out as planned. And my two oldest children were very deeply disappointed to not be back at Galil, their Havonim camp in Bucks County, PA. So they decided they were going to run a camp for their little sister, who is 4. And they decided, just to start the whole thing off, that it needed a name. They were going to call it Machane Levad, and she was going to be in Kfutza Bodeda, all by herself. I promise you that this little family camp of siblings had no formal Hebrew language instruction component or articulated language ideology. But as my kids demonstrated and how they labeled and construed the project, right, Hebrew was a part of what makes camp camp. And I believe that in seeking to give a Hebrew name to this little family camp they were running, they showed how this infusion perspective has seeped into their basic conception of what camp is, what it's for, and how it's properly done. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. Thank you to our fantastic presenters, Sarah Benor, Jonathan Krasner, and Sharon Avni. Thank you to our wonderful co-hosts at Hebrew at the Center, Andrew Ergis and Arnie Winchell. Please be on the lookout for announcements of forthcoming programs from Hebrew at the Center after the holidays. And if you're excited to learn more about what research tells us about Hebrew language education in North America, I would love to direct all of you to our website at CASJE.org, where you can find more research reports, including a very recent release co-authored by Sarah Benor and some of her colleagues about Hebrew language in part-time Jewish schools. There's a full report, a very snazzy infographic, and a link to a webinar that we did with Hebrew at the Center not too long ago. And Sharon Avni and her colleague, Avital Cartman, about a year ago published a report about Hebrew language in public schools in the US, which may be of interest to you as well. And you can find all of that at CASJE.org. Thanks to everyone for coming. Wishing you all lots of health and safety from the various plagues that our country is facing at this time. So all our best to you. Take care. Bye-bye.